A fasting glucose reading of 110 arrived on a lab report that 5 years earlier had shown 85. Nothing had changed in the interim. The same food, the same body weight within a few pounds, the same daily walk through the same streets. The physician used the term insulin resistance. When asked what had actually changed inside the body, the answer came back vague and unsatisfying. Something about the body not processing sugar as efficiently as before. The appointment ended with a diagnosis that had a name, but no explanation attached to it. What the explanation would have required was this: the cells had pulled the insulin receptor off their own surface. The resistance that the blood test measured was not damage. It was an adaptation. Every cell in the body continuously adjusts the number of receptors it keeps on its surface based on how frequently a signal arrives. And the signal that drives insulin receptor removal is insulin itself. Decades of frequent meals, snacks between those meals, glucose spikes producing insulin spikes, each spike pressing repeatedly against the receptor, had trained the cell to reduce its sensitivity by pulling back the very antenna designed to receive that signal. The resistance was the cell defending itself from a message that arrived far too often. To understand why this matters, it helps to understand what insulin actually does when it reaches the cell surface and what removing the receptor prevents. Insulin arrives at the cell membrane and attaches to the insulin receptor, a protein that spans the full width of the membrane with its binding site facing outward into the bloodstream and its signaling domain facing inward toward the cell interior. When insulin locks onto the outer portion of the receptor, the inner portion activates. The activation is mechanical in nature. Insulin docking on the outer face of the receptor produces a shape change that travels through the membrane-spanning region to the intracellular face, similar to pressing one end of a lever and watching the opposite end respond. The intracellular domain then begins adding phosphate groups to specific positions on its own structure, a process called self-phosphorylation. Each phosphate group added to the receptor's inner domain creates a docking site for the next protein in a long chain of signaling events that cascades through the interior of the cell, each protein activating the next and amplifying the original signal at every step along the way. The final output of that entire cascade is a single command delivered to the cell's internal storage compartments: move the glucose channels to the surface. Those channels are called GLUT4, which stand for glucose transporter type 4. They are the specific channels that glucose uses to enter muscle cells and fat cells. Without GLUT4 present in the cell membrane, glucose cannot cross into the cell at all. The channels are manufactured inside the cell and stored in small membrane-enclosed compartments called vesicles, positioned just beneath the cell surface and loaded with GLUT4 channels, waiting for the signal to deploy. When the insulin signaling cascade reaches its endpoint, a process called GLUT4 translocation begins through a pathway involving a protein called ACT. The cascade phosphorylates another protein called AS160, which normally holds the GLUT4 vesicles anchored in place inside the cell. The phosphorylation releases that anchor. The vesicles, now free to move, travel along actin filaments that the same signaling cascade simultaneously remodels to create a clear path from the cell interior to the membrane surface. When each vesicle reaches the membrane, proteins on the vesicle surface called snare proteins dock with matching snare proteins on the cell membrane, using the same vesicle fusion machinery that cells use for every membrane insertion event throughout the body. The vesicle membrane merges with the cell membrane. The GLUT4 channels that have been sitting in the vesicle membrane become part of the cell surface. The channels open. Glucose flows in through the newly inserted pores, each channel transporting glucose molecules one at a time from the bloodstream into the cell interior. Czech described this mechanism in the Journal of Clinical Investigation. Thousands of these channels deploying simultaneously across millions of cells produce a measurable drop in blood glucose within minutes of the insulin signal reaching the cell. The glucose monitor reading that falls after a meal is showing exactly this process in action, each cell deploying its stored channels in response to the insulin signal. The speed of that drop reflects how many receptors are available to receive the signal and how many GLUT4 channels each cell can mobilize in response. A faster drop means more receptors, stronger signaling, and more channels deployed per minute. A slower drop means fewer receptors, weaker signaling, and fewer channels opening per unit of time. The glucose monitor is measuring receptor status in real time, meal after meal. The blood glucose level falls because glucose that was circulating in the bloodstream now has a doorway to enter the cell. Insulin did not process the glucose. Insulin did not convert it, break it down, or metabolize it. Insulin opened the door. The glucose entered under its own concentration gradient, flowing from the higher concentration in the blood toward the lower concentration inside the cell through the GLUT4 channel the insulin signal had deployed. Every step of the glucose's journey from the blood into the cell depends entirely on GLUT4 being present in the membrane. Without the channel, glucose circulates past the cell surface, unable to cross, accumulating in the bloodstream, while the cell starves for the fuel floating just outside its wall. The clearest way to picture this is as a receiving antenna on a rooftop. The broadcast signal is insulin. The antenna is the receptor. The signal travels from the antenna down into the house and instructs the household to open the front door. Glucose enters through that open door. Remove the antenna and the broadcast still arrives, but the house cannot detect it. The door stays closed. Glucose remains outside. This distinction between broken machinery and interrupted communication is the most practically significant distinction in the entire physiology of insulin resistance, because broken machinery requires repair, but interrupted communication requires only that the signal environment change. The cell did not need to be fixed. The cell needed a different pattern of stimulation, and the receptor adjustment would follow naturally from the pattern change. Why does the cell remove the receiving equipment in the first place? The answer is chronic overstimulation. When any receptor receives its signal too frequently, the cell responds by pulling the receptor off the surface and storing it inside the cell in compartments called endosomes. This process is called receptor downregulation, and it operates through a mechanism known as clathrin-mediated endocytosis, the same cellular machinery the body uses for every receptor type across every tissue. Clathrin coat proteins assemble on the inner side of the membrane, form a coated pit, pinch off from the surface, and pull the receptor into an endosome inside the cell. The insulin receptor feeds through this system whenever the threshold of chronic stimulation is exceeded. Fewer receptors on the surface produce a weaker response to the same insulin concentration. The cell has effectively turned down its own sensitivity. Downregulation is proportional to both the frequency and the magnitude of stimulation. More frequent insulin spikes produce more receptor removal. Higher insulin peaks produce more receptor removal per spike. The cell reads the pattern of stimulation and continuously adjusts its receptor count to match. Saltiel and Kahn established this in the journal Nature. The practical arithmetic of this is straightforward. 3 meals with no snacking produce 3 insulin spikes per day, with several hours of low insulin between each one. During those low insulin windows, the receptors that were internalized have time to recycle back to the cell surface. 6 eating events per day, including snacks between meals, produce 6 to 8 insulin spikes with minimal recovery time between them. The receptors are pulled off faster than they can return. The net surface count drops across months and years. This dose-response pattern follows measurable changes in receptor surface density over time. And once the downregulation begins, it becomes a self-reinforcing spiral. Fewer surface receptors produce a weaker cellular response to the same insulin concentration. The pancreas detects the weakened response through blood glucose that remains elevated after a meal, because the glucose that should have entered the cells through GLUT4 stayed in the bloodstream instead. The pancreas responds by producing more insulin, essentially sending a louder signal to compensate for the reduced number of signal-receiving devices. The louder signal reaches the remaining receptors, and the cell reads that louder signal as further evidence of chronic overstimulation. More receptors are pulled off. The signal must become louder still. The spiral drives itself forward with its own momentum. The arithmetic of this spiral is slow and therefore invisible on any single blood test. Each year, the receptor count drops by a small percentage. Each year, the fasting insulin rises by a small amount to compensate. Each year, the beta cells in the pancreas work slightly harder. The accumulation remains invisible because the glucose stays normal. The compensation is succeeding even as the underlying receptor count declines. The spiral runs for years, sometimes for a decade or more, behind a perfectly normal glucose reading. It becomes detectable only if someone measures the fasting insulin level, which standard screening rarely includes. A fasting insulin of 25 microunits per milliliter, roughly 4 times the level considered optimal, can maintain a fasting glucose of 92 for years. The glucose looks healthy. The insulin tells an entirely different story. The pancreas is working 4 times harder than it should need to because the receptor count has dropped enough to require 4 times the signal to produce the same glucose clearance. The hidden decade between the onset of receptor downregulation and the first abnormal glucose test is the window where intervention is most effective and least likely to occur because the metric being monitored does not reveal the problem until the compensation has already been running for years. The fasting glucose number carries a specific physics that most people have never been told. The morning reading is not a reflection of what was eaten the night before in any straightforward way. The morning number is largely new glucose that the liver manufactured overnight. Between approximately 4 and 8 in the morning, the liver increases its glucose production rate as part of the body's normal circadian awakening response. Cortisol rises during this window, peaking roughly 30 to 45 minutes after waking, and cortisol stimulates a process called hepatic gluconeogenesis, in which the liver converts amino acids, lactate, and glycerol into glucose molecules and releases them into the bloodstream. This production is biologically necessary. The brain requires a steady glucose supply overnight. The muscles need a ready fuel source for the physical demands of waking. The cortisol surge ensures the liver provides it. The system operates perfectly when the insulin signal can regulate the production rate. The liver produces glucose. Insulin signals how much is sufficient, and the liver listens and modulates its output accordingly. Samuel and Schulman documented the failure of this regulatory loop in cell metabolism. When the liver's insulin receptors are fully functional, insulin suppresses this overnight glucose production. The liver reads the insulin signal as meaning enough glucose is already available, stops manufacturing more, and reduces its output accordingly. The fasting glucose stays in the normal range because the liver's production is held in check by an insulin signal it can clearly receive. When the liver's insulin receptors have downregulated through the same mechanism that affected the muscle cells, the liver can no longer hear the suppression signal. Insulin is circulating in the bloodstream, but the liver's receptors have been internalized. The liver keeps manufacturing glucose because the message telling it to stop is not getting through. The glucose it produces overnight adds to whatever residual glucose remains from the previous day, and the fasting number rises. Eating nothing after 6 in the evening and checking glucose at 7 the following morning, finding it higher than it was at 10 the previous night, is seeing the liver's overnight production directly. The glucose went up during a fast because the liver manufactured it and released it into a bloodstream whose insulin signal was too weak to instruct the liver to stop. The morning number is about what the liver produced while the body slept, driven by a cortisol signal the liver followed, and an insulin signal the liver could no longer hear. Once the spiral has been running long enough, the organ that has been compensating for the entire system, the pancreas, begins to show the cost of years of overproduction. Beta cells in the islets of Langerhans produce insulin. When the body's receptor count drops and higher insulin levels are needed to maintain glucose clearance, the beta cells increase their protein synthesis rate to produce more insulin per cell. This compensation works for years, sometimes for more than a decade. The fasting glucose stays near normal while the circulating insulin level climbs steadily. The glucose test reads normal. The insulin level, which is rarely tested in routine screening, is elevated. The resistance is hidden behind successful compensation. The glucose is normal. The physician reports that the numbers look fine, and the spiraling insulin resistance accumulates silently because the metric being checked is still being held in range by a pancreas that is working progressively harder every year to maintain it. Compensation has a measurable biological cost. Beta cells running at maximum protein synthesis capacity for extended periods accumulate stress in the endoplasmic reticulum, the organelle responsible for folding and packaging the insulin protein. Proinsulin, the precursor molecule, requires precise chemical bond formation inside the endoplasmic reticulum to fold into functional insulin. Chaperone proteins, particularly one called BIP, assist each molecule through the folding process. Under chronic overproduction, these chaperones become saturated, misfolded proinsulin accumulates, and the cell activates what is called the unfolded protein response. The cell attempts to reduce its protein synthesis rate and increase the folding capacity of the endoplasmic reticulum. If the stress resolves, the cell recovers. If the demand continues at maximum, the folding machinery cannot keep pace, misfolded proteins accumulate, and the cell activates its programmed death pathway. The beta cell eliminates itself rather than releasing defective insulin into the circulation. Beta cells begin dying. Each dead beta cell represents permanently lost production capacity because adult beta cells have very limited regenerative ability. The insulin-producing population shrinks. The output that had been maintaining glucose control despite elevated resistance starts to decline. The compensation that sustained normal glucose for a decade fails. The fasting glucose rises above the diagnostic threshold. The diagnosis changes from insulin resistance to type 2 diabetes. Cerf described this progression in Frontiers in Endocrinology. The transition from resistance to diabetes is a production failure following years of overproduction. The cells that compensated exhausted themselves in the process of compensating. The critical and often overlooked fact is that the adaptation is reversible. The receptors the cell pulled off the surface are stored inside the cell in endosomes, not destroyed. The endosome is a storage compartment, not a degradation compartment. The receptors inside it are intact, functional, and ready to reinsert into the membrane when the cellular machinery transports them back to the surface. What reverses the downregulation is a change in the signal environment that drove the receptors off the surface in the first place. There are three primary inputs, each targeting a different component of the signal pressure that drove the receptor internalization. The first is meal spacing. Fewer meals mean fewer insulin spikes and more time at low insulin between them, which means less receptor internalization pressure. 3 meals without snacking provides a pattern of spike followed by recovery, spike followed by recovery, spike followed by overnight recovery. Each recovery window allows receptors to recycle from endosomes back to the cell surface. Constant grazing eliminates those recovery windows entirely. After each meal, the insulin peak takes approximately 3 to 4 hours to return to baseline. A recovery window of 2 to 3 hours at low insulin allows receptor recycling before the next meal drives the next spike. 3 meals with no snacking provides 3 recovery windows per day. 6 eating events provide effectively 0 recovery windows because each spike overlaps with the clearance phase of the preceding one. The second input is physical movement after meals. Muscle contraction activates a second pathway to GLUT4 translocation that completely bypasses the insulin receptor. A 20-minute walk after eating clears glucose through the exercise pathway without requiring insulin at all. Blood glucose drops. The pancreas produces less insulin in response. The signal frequency decreases, and the receptor downregulation pressure eases. The exercise pathway does double duty, simultaneously clearing glucose and reducing the insulin signal that drives the resistance. This bypass is pharmacologically significant. It means glucose can enter the cell even when the insulin receptor has been fully downregulated, because the exercise pathway uses a completely different signaling cascade that does not depend on the receptor the cell removed. The muscle cell that cannot hear insulin can still absorb glucose if the muscle is contracting. The two pathways open the same door through different locks, and the exercise lock still works when the insulin lock has been compromised. AMPK-mediated GLUT4 translocation is the mechanism. Walking after each meal is the single most effective non-pharmaceutical intervention for insulin resistance because it simultaneously clears glucose through the bypass pathway and reduces the insulin spike that drives receptor downregulation. Each walk produces both effects from one behavior. The 20 minutes after eating is the window where blood glucose is at its highest and the walk's impact is at its greatest. The timing is not arbitrary. It is pharmacokinetically optimal. The third input is eating speed. The height of the glucose peak, and therefore the height of the insulin spike that follows, is directly influenced by how quickly a meal is consumed. The same meal eaten quickly produces a higher glucose peak and a larger insulin spike, generating more receptor overstimulation per meal. The same meal eaten over 25 minutes produces a lower peak, a smaller spike, and less receptor pressure per meal. A meal producing a glucose peak of 160 milligrams per deciliter triggers approximately twice the insulin release of the same meal producing a peak of 120. Each meal, where faster eating drives the peak higher, adds to the cumulative receptor stimulation load the cell responds to by pulling more receptors off the surface. Across 3 meals per day and 365 days per year, the difference between a 20-minute meal and a 6-minute meal compounds into a measurably different receptor stimulation profile across months and years. There's a fourth factor that operates on a slower timescale, but is equally relevant: the composition of the cell membrane itself. The insulin receptor sits within the cell membrane, and its ability to cluster with other signaling proteins after insulin binding depends on how fluid the membrane is. A membrane rich in unsaturated fatty acids is more fluid, allowing the receptor to move laterally and cluster efficiently for signal transduction. A membrane stiffened by excess saturated fat or trans fat restricts the receptor's lateral mobility, weakening the signal even when the receptor count is adequate. The membrane composition is determined over weeks to months by the types of dietary fat consumed. A membrane that has incorporated more omega-3 fatty acids from sources such as fish, flaxseed, or walnuts provides the fluidity the receptor needs to cluster and signal effectively. A membrane that has incorporated more trans fats from processed food stiffens the lipid bilayer and restricts the receptor's movement, weakening the signal even from receptors that are present and functional on the surface. The direction of all these changes is consistent and measurable. Clinical studies consistently show measurable improvements in insulin sensitivity within 2 to 4 weeks of interventions that reduce chronic hyperinsulinemia. The receptor recycling is that responsive. When the internalization rate drops below the recycling rate because the chronic stimulation has been reduced, the net surface receptor count begins climbing back towards baseline, and the downstream GLUT4 translocation improves proportionally as the receptor count on the surface increases. Peterson and Schulman confirmed this in physiological reviews. Whether a specific fasting glucose number requires clinical intervention, medication, dietary modification, or monitoring is a determination a physician makes through evaluation of the full metabolic profile, including hemoglobin A1c, fasting insulin, and individual risk factors. The physics explains what insulin resistance is at the cellular level. The physician determines what a specific individual's numbers require. If fasting glucose has risen gradually across 5 to 10 years, asking for a fasting insulin level alongside the fasting glucose provides a more complete picture. The glucose tells whether the compensation is still working. The insulin tells how hard the pancreas is working to maintain it. Both numbers together reveal the stage of the spiral that the single glucose test alone cannot show. Insulin resistance was an adaptation from the very beginning. Every cell adjusts its receptor count based on signal frequency. This is the same physics across every receptor system in the body. Capsaicin receptors, adenosine receptors, and insulin receptors all adjust through one cellular principle. Chronic signal produces reduced receptor count, which produces a weakened response. The adjustment is the cell maintaining its own operating range in an environment that pushed it beyond the range the receptor was calibrated for. The word resistance implies something is broken. The physics shows something is adapting. The adaptation reverses when the environment changes. The cell that received insulin too frequently pulled the receptor off the surface, reduced its sensitivity, and waited for the signaling environment to shift. The signaling environment is what is eaten, when it is eaten, how fast it is eaten, and whether the muscles move in the period that follows. Each of those variables feeds the signal frequency the cell reads when deciding how many receptors to keep on its surface. The reversal is giving the cell a reason to put the receptor back. Every input that reduces the signal frequency or lowers the spike height gives the cell that reason. The resistance was the answer to a signal that came too often. The reversal is a signal that comes less often. The cell adapts in both directions. The direction depends entirely on the environment the body creates for it.